The scent of varnished oak still hung in the air as I stepped into his courtroom and watched my father-in-law go pale. Still gripping his gavel, he froze because now he remembered whose name was on the case file. As the clerk read Rachel Monroe v. Matthew Barnes, the color drained from his face like a man watching his legacy bleed. While the room sat in silence, I didn't flinch. I wanted him to feel every second of it. The same man who let Barnes destroy me was now trapped behind his own bench. That's when I met his eyes and gave him the look he never gave me: justice. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence, it lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Rachel Monroe stood in front of the building, gazing up at the sleek glass and steel structure. It had once felt like home, the place where her career had flourished, where she had made names for herself and her clients. Now, it loomed over her like a monument to everything she had lost. The law firm had been her life until Matthew Barnes had torn it all down. She walked through the revolving door with quiet determination, the scent of polished wood and fresh carpet instantly taking her back. Her steps echoed through the expansive lobby, and for a moment she wondered if anyone would recognize her. If they did, they'd likely dismiss her as just another forgotten relic of the past, a casualty of time and betrayal. She ignored the receptionist's polite greeting, choosing instead to head straight for the elevators. On the 10th floor, she found the office door she knew so well. It was locked. She could almost hear Matthew's voice in her mind telling her she was done here, but Rachel wasn't done. She had come to finish what had been started years ago, to take back what was hers and bring the truth to light. Linda Daniels was waiting for her in the corner office, her back turned as she scanned some documents on her tablet. Linda had been Rachel's secret weapon, an ally in the shadows, quietly gathering evidence from the outside while Rachel had rebuilt herself piece by piece. The younger lawyer's energy was different from Rachel's, sharp, impatient, but it had been a vital ally in the fight. Rachel smiled faintly when Linda turned around, her eyes sparking with recognition. There was no need for formalities. "You're sure everything is in place?" Rachel asked, her voice steady but with a weight behind it that Linda knew all too well. Linda nodded, pushing a thick folder across the desk. "Everything, the hard drives, the financial records, the correspondence. We've got everything we need to take him down. Are you ready?" Rachel's fingers grazed the edge of the folder, but she didn't open it. Not yet. She let the quiet tension of the moment settle between them. "I've been ready for this day for years," Rachel said, the words landing like stones in a still pond. Just then, the door to the office opened and a figure stepped inside. It was an old colleague of Rachel's, someone who had once been a part of the team before the betrayal, before Barnes had taken control. The colleague's face froze when they saw Rachel standing there, looking the same as ever, only colder, sharper. "Rachel," the man said, his voice faltering, "I didn't think you'd ever show your face again." "I didn't think you'd still be working for him," Rachel replied, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't angry, there was no room for that now, just the hard clarity of someone who had been wronged beyond repair. The man shifted uncomfortably, and for a moment the old familiarity between them seemed to resurface. But it was fleeting, and he quickly glanced at Linda, then back to Rachel. "Matthew's changed," he said, as if trying to explain away the years of manipulation and deceit. "You know how things are now." Rachel's lips twitched, but the emotion that sparked inside her was gone before it could surface. There was no place for pity in this fight, not now, not ever. "Tell him I'm coming for him," Rachel said, her voice cold with the resolve of someone who had been through too much to back down. "And this time, I won't lose." The colleague's face paled, his eyes darting nervously between the two women, but he didn't say anything else. He left without a word, and Rachel turned back to Linda, who was watching her with admiration. "Time to make my re-entry," Rachel said quietly. She stood, gathered her things, and walked toward the elevator. The doors opened with a soft ping, and for a brief moment she hesitated, her hand on the button. The truth was that this wasn't just about revenge. It was about proving something to herself, showing that she could stand tall again after everything that had been taken from her. The elevator descended smoothly, but inside, Rachel's mind was already racing ahead. Barnes hadn't expected her to return. He thought she was finished, but she wasn't. Not by a long shot. The doors opened on the ground floor and Rachel stepped into the lobby, making her way toward the door. As she passed the receptionist's desk, she gave the woman a brief nod, but her mind was already elsewhere. There was no time for small talk. Back at her car, Rachel pulled out her phone and called Linda. "It's time," Rachel said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "File the motion." A pause on the other end, then Linda's reply, steady and firm, "Done." Rachel's fingers tightened around the steering wheel as she pulled out of the parking lot. She hadn't just returned to the legal world, she had re-entered the lion's den. And this time she wasn't leaving until she brought it all down. The courthouse was as sterile and cold as Rachel remembered. The stone walls, the sharp echo of footsteps, the tension in the air, it all felt like a stage set for something inevitable. Her heels clicked against the marble floors as she walked through the corridor, her thoughts sharp but focused. Today was the first step in bringing everything back into the light. Today was when the world would begin to understand that Rachel Monroe was not someone you forgot. The courtroom doors swung open, and she stepped inside, the heavy silence of the room settling over her like a thick fog. Rachel stood tall, her back straight, her gaze steady. All eyes were on her as she made her way to the table, her movements calculated, deliberate. The case wasn't just about the legal battle, it was about proving she was more than the woman who had been pushed out of the firm, more than the wife who had quietly retreated into the shadows of her family's expectations. She was the woman who had been wronged, and she was here to take everything back. Judge James Foster sat at the bench, his dark suit and solemn expression making him seem impervious to the weight of the room. As Rachel took her seat, his eyes flicked over her briefly, then returned to the paperwork in front of him as though she were just another nameless lawyer. But Rachel knew better. The judge had been there at the heart of the betrayal. His role was far deeper than a mere spectator, one she intended to reveal, but not yet. She could sense the unease settling into the air, something the judge was trying hard to suppress. His eyes lingered for a moment longer than they should have, flicking from the papers back to Rachel. It was as if her presence reminded him of something he couldn't quite grasp, but that gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. Rachel didn't look at him directly. She never did in court, not unless she needed to. She kept her focus on the documents in front of her, her fingers brushing against the evidence she had painstakingly collected. She wasn't about to let anyone see how much this case meant to her, not yet. Aaron and Grace were in the gallery. Rachel felt their eyes on her, but she didn't flinch. Her son's worried gaze cut through the cold, and Grace, as always, wore a mask of polished indifference. They had no idea what Rachel had been preparing for. They had no idea that this case wasn't just about money or revenge. This was her redemption, and they too would have to see the truth. The judge cleared his throat, his voice more clipped than before. "Let's proceed, Ms. Monroe," he said, as if her name were just another word he had to say, but Rachel could feel the tension in his tone, the discomfort. He wasn't as unaffected as he wanted everyone to believe. She rose, moving with the same calm precision that had defined her career, and began presenting the first piece of evidence. A series of emails she had uncovered, emails that would prove Barnes had lied about the financial agreements they had made. But as Rachel spoke, she noticed the subtle change in the judge's posture. His fingers twitched and his eyes flickered toward her once more. A sharp recognition was forming behind those steady, calculating eyes. There was something unsettling about the way he was watching her now. The judge wasn't just hearing the case, he was trying to place her, trying to pull her from the recesses of his memory. He shifted uneasily, a hint of discomfort that even his professionalism couldn't fully disguise. "Ms. Monroe," Judge Foster finally spoke, his voice tight. "Is there a reason why this case is just now being brought forward? Why was it not addressed years ago?" Rachel didn't flinch at the question, she had expected it. "Some cases take time, Your Honor," she replied evenly, "but now the truth can no longer be hidden." The judge's face tightened, the edges of his composure beginning to fray. He paused, and for the first time Rachel saw it, the faint flicker of recognition. His eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. She saw him mentally retracing the years, pulling at the threads of their past. The room felt colder as the weight of their shared history pressed down on him. And then the moment she had been waiting for came, the unmistakable flicker of realization in his eyes. He hadn't forgotten her. He had been part of the reason she had been torn down. The man sitting at that bench was not just a judge. He was someone who had played a role in the conspiracy that had destroyed her. Rachel's gaze locked on him, unflinching. The judge's face turned pale. He was trying to control it, trying to hide his unease, but it was too late. Your Honor, Rachel's voice cut through the silence as if to further prod at the breaking mask of calm. She spoke softly but with an undeniable force. You remember me now, don't you? The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. He said nothing, but his knuckles were white as he gripped the sides of his bench. At that moment, Grace leaned over to Aaron in the gallery, her voice too loud, too dismissive. This is just ridiculous, she whispered. Mom's dragging us into her irrelevant vendetta. Why can't she just let go? Rachel's eyes never left the judge's face, but she heard Grace's words loud and clear. And for a split second she felt the sting of her daughter-in-law's judgment. It wasn't about her vendetta, it was about truth, and it was about time the people who had discarded her, including her own family, realized it. The judge straightened, trying to regain control, but Rachel knew the moment had passed. The cracks in his armor were showing. He would never be the same after this. The courtroom was holding its breath, the tension thick. Rachel hadn't even begun to fight yet, but she could already taste the power that was beginning to shift. This was only the beginning, and she was going to make sure they all knew it. Rachel's hands trembled as she picked up the glass of water, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. She hadn't allowed herself to feel much since she re-entered this fight, not the anger, not the loss, not even the hurt that still lingered just beneath the surface. But sitting in Linda's office now, with the weight of all the evidence laid out before her, it was harder to keep the walls up. Linda Daniels leaned forward, the fluorescent lights above casting sharp shadows across her face as she pulled up the files on her tablet. Here it is, she said, her voice steady and unwavering. The screen flickered briefly before revealing a series of financial records. A chain of transactions, each one more incriminating than the last, linked Barnes to a series of fraudulent activities during their years as partners. Rachel stared at them, her eyes narrowing as she absorbed the cold, hard proof. It wasn't just betrayal, it was calculated, malicious, and it had been hidden behind a veil of authority and charm. Barnes had been careful, sure. He had built his empire on lies and deception, but now Rachel had everything. Every email, every misfiled document, every illegally altered contract. Look at this, Linda said, tapping the screen. He moved millions through these shell companies, thought he'd covered his tracks, but this is his undoing. Rachel's fingers brushed the edge of the tablet as she leaned in. The words on the screen didn't just represent money, they represented everything she had lost: her career, her sense of purpose, her reputation. They were like daggers that had been driven deep, and now she held the handles. But the fury, the righteous anger she'd once felt, was no longer there. Instead, there was a deep, quiet resolve, the kind that had been brewing for years. Barnes had been comfortable in his power, assuming Rachel had given up, but she hadn't. She'd been preparing, waiting for this moment, and now he would face the consequences. She swallowed, pushing the glass aside, and looked Linda in the eye. He thought he was untouchable, she said, her voice low, almost to herself, but he wasn't careful enough. Linda's eyes flickered with something unreadable, admiration perhaps, or a flicker of fear at the darkness that had entered Rachel's eyes. You've got everything you need. I don't know how he's going to wiggle out of this one. Rachel didn't respond immediately. She sat back in her chair, letting the weight of the moment settle in. This wasn't just about putting Barnes behind bars. This was about making him pay for the years he'd stolen from her. She wasn't just going after his business or his reputation. She was going after his freedom, his life. I'm going to take him down, Rachel said, the certainty in her words echoing in the stillness of the room. But it's not enough to just expose him. He has to feel every ounce of it. Every single betrayal, every piece of misery he caused. It's time he pays, and I mean in every way possible. Linda's fingers hovered over her tablet, typing quickly, financial restitution. Rachel nodded, every penny and then some. I want him bankrupt. I want him to watch his empire crumble the way he watched mine do. Sounds like you're not just going for justice here, Linda remarked, her voice soft. No, I'm not, Rachel said, her gaze hardening. I'm going for something deeper. I'm going to make sure that when this is over, no one ever forgets what he did. Rachel shifted her weight, standing up and pacing around the small office. She felt the pull of the past again, the years of quiet suffering when she'd been a widow, a mother estranged, a former lawyer without a purpose. She had let it all simmer beneath the surface, but now that old Rachel was gone. She had something to fight for, and it was bigger than her pride. I'm going to reach out to a few of my old contacts, Rachel continued, her voice steady. People who knew the truth, people who knew how Barnes manipulated the system before he covered his tracks. I'll bring them in, they'll testify, he won't be able to hide behind his money anymore. Linda nodded, tapping at her tablet, pulling up a list of potential witnesses. I'll get the paperwork ready. Rachel felt a weight lift from her chest as she moved toward the door, ready to leave the office, ready to face Barnes head-on. She was so close now, so close to the finish line, but as she turned to face Linda one last time, something stopped her. The calm was deceptive. There was a storm brewing beneath her composed exterior. It was only a matter of time before the truth would break. I want to make sure this goes beyond just the courtroom, Linda, Rachel said, her voice quiet but fierce. I want every corner of his life torn apart. Let the world know who he really is. Linda didn't respond, but she didn't need to. The agreement was clear in the way she nodded. Rachel's fingers brushed the door handle, but as her hand wrapped around it, she froze. The weight of everything, the years of silence, the anger she had buried so deeply, crashed over her in a wave. This wasn't just about Barnes anymore. This was about making the world understand that Rachel Monroe could never be forgotten. Not now, not ever. The door clicked open and Rachel stepped into the hallway, her steps echoing sure and deliberate. But there was something else too, a quiet voice deep inside whispering that this fight would be harder than she had ever imagined. And Barnes wouldn't be the only one who paid the price. The storm was coming. The house felt too quiet as Rachel stood in the kitchen, her fingers resting on the cold countertop, the faint scent of coffee hanging in the air. It was earlier than usual, the quiet before the storm. She hadn't planned to be here today, hadn't planned on facing them yet, but Aaron had called, asking her to come over. The urgency in his voice had unsettled her, and so here she was. The door creaked open behind her, and she didn't need to turn around to know who it was. She could feel the presence of her son before he even spoke. Mom, we need to talk, Aaron said, his voice heavy with concern. Rachel straightened, lifting her chin just a little higher, and turned to face him. His face, always so handsome and confident, now held a wrinkle of worry between his brows. He was still in his suit from work, his jacket slung over his arm. Grace wasn't with him, not yet, but Rachel knew she would be soon. She had a way of inserting herself into things, even when Rachel wished she would just let them be. About what? Rachel asked, her voice cool but not unkind. Aaron stepped closer, placing his hands on the counter in front of her, his gaze intense. About this case, about Barnes. Rachel could feel a knot tighten in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. It wasn't the first time Aaron had expressed concern about her health, about the toll this case was taking on her. But this time, something was different. There was a desperation in his tone she hadn't heard before. Mom, I don't get it. Why are you doing this? He asked, his voice softer now, trying to reach her. You've already lost so much because of him. You've been through hell. Why risk your health? Why risk everything for a battle that's long over? The words stung more than they should have. Aaron was her only child, and yet in that moment he seemed so distant. She felt the weight of his misunderstanding pressing down on her, heavier than anything Barnes had ever done. You don't understand, she said, her voice firm but laced with a quiet ache. This isn't about health. It's not even about what happened to me. It's about what Barnes did to everything I worked for. My career, my reputation, my life. I was forced into silence for too long, and now I have a chance to make it right. Aaron's jaw tightened as he watched her, his expression shifting from concern to something deeper, frustration, maybe disappointment. But you're not going to win, Mom. Barnes is too powerful. The court system, the media, they're all going to tear you apart again. That's where you're wrong, Rachel replied, her voice steady. I've been preparing for this for years. I know what I'm doing, Aaron, and I'm not backing down. Aaron shook his head, running a hand through his hair. I'm not asking you to back down. I'm asking you to let it go. For your own sake, I can help you. I can make sure you're financially set for the rest of your life. You won't have to fight anymore. You don't need this, Mom. Rachel felt a cold wave of frustration wash over her, and for the first time she let her gaze drop from his, avoiding the pity she saw creeping into his eyes. He didn't get it. He never had. Money isn't the point, she said, her voice tight. It's not about comfort, it's about justice. I can't live knowing Barnes is out there continuing to ruin lives. I don't want comfort, I want the truth to come out, and I want him to pay for what he's done. Erin took a deep breath, stepping back slightly as if trying to process her words, as if weighing something in his mind. When he spoke again, his voice was strained. I can't just watch you destroy yourself over this. It's not worth it. You have a family who loves you. Grace and we just want you to be okay. Grace? Rachel felt a flicker of irritation, but she suppressed it. She had always been there, always pushing Rachel to give in to comfort, to avoid confrontation. Grace never understood, never could. And Erin, despite everything, was too wrapped up in her influence to see what Rachel needed. You don't understand, Erin, Rachel said, her voice quieter now, a finality in her words. You think I'm doing this because I'm angry, because I want revenge, but I'm doing this because I need to, because it's the only way I'll be able to live with myself again. Erin's face softened, his eyes searching hers as if looking for something he couldn't find. And in that moment Rachel realized something painful but true. Her son would never truly understand, not this, not the depths of what she had lost, and not the strength it took to fight for what was right, even when it felt like the world had turned its back on her. Please just let it go, Erin said again, his voice quieter now, almost pleading, for your own sake. But Rachel shook her head. I can't, she whispered, I won't. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, one she didn't know how to cross. Erin turned, his expression a mixture of frustration and concern, but Rachel didn't call him back. She didn't have the strength to explain herself again. He couldn't hear her, not now. And just like that, he left. The door clicked shut behind him with a finality that left Rachel feeling colder than she had in years. She exhaled slowly, her fingers trembling ever so slightly as they pressed into the cool surface of the counter. There was a time when she had hoped things would be different, that Erin would stand by her, but now she understood he never would. Rachel stood there, alone in the quiet kitchen, the weight of everything pressing down on her. The battle was far from over, and she would fight it with or without them. The courtroom buzzed with a nervous energy, the kind that prickled under your skin and made the air feel heavy. Rachel sat in her seat, her gaze focused on the front of the room, the tightness in her chest a reminder of everything she was risking. Today was just another hearing, more motions, more procedural steps in the long road to confronting Barnes. But she could feel it, the subtle shift in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. Matthew Barnes sat across from her at the defense table, his smug face practically oozing arrogance, as if he hadn't a care in the world. Rachel had been looking forward to this day for years, but now, as the judge called the room to order, she felt a deep sense of calm settle over her. This was her moment. The judge, still recovering from the uncomfortable tension Rachel had created in their previous hearings, settled his papers and gave a curt nod to the attorneys. Let's proceed. Rachel's eyes flicked toward Linda, who sat beside her, fingers poised over the legal pad. Linda's face was unreadable, but Rachel knew her well enough to see the sharp focus behind her young attorney's eyes. They had prepared for this, but nothing could prepare them for what was about to happen. Without warning, the door to the courtroom swung open and a figure stepped inside, casting a shadow that stretched long across the floor. Rachel's heart skipped. A new presence, someone unexpected. The man was tall, wearing a neatly pressed suit, but it was his face that struck Rachel first. It was familiar, a former associate of Barnes, a man she hadn't seen in years. He'd been part of the firm when things had begun to unravel before Rachel had been forced out. The room fell silent as the man approached the witness stand. His name was Michael Hayes, a name Rachel had buried deep in the recesses of her mind. He was the one who had quietly vanished after everything had gone wrong, the one who had disappeared without a trace, never to be heard from again, until now. The judge raised an eyebrow. Mr. Hayes, I wasn't expecting you. Michael cleared his throat, his gaze briefly locking with Rachel's. There was something uneasy in his expression, but his voice was steady. I have information regarding the defendant, Your Honor, information that I believe is crucial to this case. Rachel's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for, the moment that would turn everything. She had always suspected there were others out there who knew the truth, people who had seen Barnes for what he was. She hadn't expected one of them to step forward so abruptly, but here he was. Linda shot Rachel a quick glance, her expression tight with caution, but there was no time for hesitation now. The judge nodded for Michael to continue. Go ahead, Mr. Hayes. Michael's eyes darted to Barnes, who was sitting perfectly still, his face unreadable. Rachel watched as Barnes' jaw tightened, his hands resting stiffly on the table. He knew something was coming, he just didn't know how much. "I was part of Barnes' team when things first began to fall apart," Michael started, his voice low but clear. "I was one of the few who saw what was really going on behind the scenes." He paused, casting a quick, almost apologetic look toward Rachel. Rachel Monroe was framed. Everything that happened to her, the collapse of her career, the public disgrace, it was all planned. Barnes orchestrated the entire thing. Rachel's breath caught in her throat, but she forced herself to stay composed. She had always suspected it, but hearing it out loud, confirmed by someone who had been in the room, was a bitter pill to swallow. The courtroom was silent, the tension palpable. Barnes' eyes widened, but only for a moment. He quickly regained his composure, but his face was ashen. The mask he had worn so carefully for years had cracked. He was exposed. Michael continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "I have proof, emails, financial records, the deals Barnes made to cover up his corruption. I was there when he ordered people to erase evidence, to destroy files. He made sure Rachel Monroe was blamed for everything that went wrong. He used her as a scapegoat." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, but Rachel's focus was on Barnes. She could see the way his fingers twitched, how his eyes darted to his lawyers as if hoping they would intervene. But it was too late. The truth was out. Rachel's chest tightened with a mixture of vindication and something darker. It wasn't enough to hear it, she wanted to see it all crumble, to watch him unravel in front of everyone. "I'll show you the records," Michael said, pulling a thick folder from his briefcase and sliding it across to the prosecution table. "These documents are proof of everything. I wasn't just an observer, I was part of it, and I can't stay silent anymore." Barnes' face had turned pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. His grip on the table had gone white-knuckled. For a moment, Rachel allowed herself to look at him, to really see him. The man who had ruined her life was sitting there, finally realizing that his empire was built on lies and deceit. Grace and Aaron sat in the gallery, their eyes wide with shock. Aaron looked like he had been struck dumb, his hand gripping the armrest as though trying to steady himself. Grace, for the first time since Rachel had seen her, was completely silent, her polished facade cracking. Rachel wanted to turn and look at them to see if they understood, if they saw how much this meant. But she didn't. She kept her gaze fixed on Barnes, watching as his world collapsed around him. Linda leaned in, whispering something to Rachel, but Rachel didn't hear. She was too focused on the unraveling truth, on the witness who had come forward, and on the realization that this battle was far from over. But Barnes, he was finished. The courtroom was stifling now. The air thick with anticipation. Rachel sat straight in her chair, her hands resting on the edge of the table, her fingers lightly tapping the surface. Her heart beat steady, methodical, like the ticking of a clock. Each second that passed felt like a countdown, building the pressure in the room to a near breaking point. She could sense the collective shift, the weight of the evidence she had carefully amassed now about to come crashing down. Barnes' face had gone from pale to a tense, almost greenish hue, his eyes darting from the judge to his defense team, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were turning white. Rachel knew the walls were closing in. He could feel it too. "Ms. Monroe," the judge said, his voice strained as he looked down at the documents in front of him. "You may proceed." Rachel didn't hesitate. She'd waited long enough for this moment. The pieces of her case had fallen into place like a perfectly constructed puzzle, and now the time for subtlety was over. She stood, her movements deliberate, her presence commanding attention in a way that was undeniable. The judge's gaze shifted nervously, but Rachel held his stare. She was no longer the woman Barnes had broken. She was the one in control now. Rachel turned to face the court, her voice steady and unwavering as she began to present the final pieces of evidence. The room fell into a tense silence as she laid out the irrefutable proof, the emails, the financial transactions, the hidden accounts, all of it connected, all of it damning. "These records," Rachel began, "show how Matthew Barnes not only deceived clients but systematically framed me for his failures. He manipulated financial reports, altered legal documents, and destroyed evidence, all to cover his tracks. But he didn't think anyone would come after him. He didn't think I would survive." Rachel paused for a moment, her gaze sweeping across the room. She allowed the silence to settle, letting the weight of her words sink in. The audience in the gallery was motionless, captivated by the undeniable clarity of the evidence. Her eyes moved to Barnes. He was trying to keep it together, but she could see the sweat beading on his forehead, the slight tremor in his hands. His mind was racing, and she knew exactly what he was thinking, that he was running out of time. But this was her moment, the moment she had been working toward for years. Barnes leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. "This is all circumstantial," he spat, trying to regain control. "None of this proves I'm guilty. You can't just—" Rachel's calm gaze never wavered. She lifted a file, pulling out a letter Barnes thought had been destroyed. It was the final blow, the document that tied everything together. The letter, signed by Barnes himself, confirming the illegal actions he had taken to frame her. The courtroom gasped in unison. Rachel's eyes stayed fixed on Barnes, watching as his face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The evidence was undeniable. "Your Honor," Rachel said, her voice firm but controlled, "this letter proves Barnes' direct involvement in the conspiracy against me. It wasn't just about money, it was about silencing me, destroying everything I worked for. And now I will make sure the truth comes to light." Barnes finally broke his silence. "This is a setup," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I was framed, she's lying." The judge held up his hand, silencing him. "Enough, Mr. Barnes," he said, his voice steely with authority. It was clear the judge was no longer able to deny the facts in front of him. Barnes' once confident facade had shattered. Rachel turned her attention back to the judge, her expression resolute. "This case isn't just about money, it's about justice, about holding people accountable for the harm they cause, and today I'm here to make sure Barnes pays for his." The room was dead silent as the judge glanced over the documents one more time. His face had grown darker, his eyes filled with the weight of the truth that had been brought to light. A moment passed, and then finally the judge spoke again, his voice quieter now, as though he too had felt the impact of the evidence. "We'll take a recess," he said, standing and motioning to the bailiff. "I need some time to review these materials." Rachel remained standing as the judge left the bench, his decision hanging in the air. The tension in the room was palpable, but Rachel's focus didn't waver. She'd done it. She had made her case, and now it was just a matter of time before Barnes was held accountable. As she turned to sit, she caught a glimpse of Aaron and Grace in the gallery. Aaron's face was unreadable, but Grace's was twisted with disbelief, her mouth hanging open. It was clear they hadn't understood the full scope of the truth until now, and Rachel felt the weight of that realization settle heavily in her chest. They had been so sure that this fight was in the past, that it was over, that Rachel was just clinging to something futile. But Rachel knew better. This was far from over. The judge had ordered a recess, but for Rachel, the real battle was just beginning. The courtroom buzzed with muted conversations as the recess stretched on. The moment of tension had passed, but the air was still thick, charged with anticipation. Rachel sat back in her seat, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She felt the eyes on her, the weight of every pair of eyes in the room, and yet, for the first time in years, she didn't feel small. Barnes, still at the defense table, looked like a man who had aged 10 years in the span of a few hours. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched so hard that his knuckles had gone white. He had tried to talk his way out of it, he'd tried to deflect, to manipulate the narrative. But now the walls were closing in, and Rachel could almost see the cracks forming in his carefully constructed world. The judge's gavel finally struck, signaling the end of the recess, and everyone returned to their seats. The room went quiet as the judge stepped back onto the bench, his face pale but determined. Rachel met his eyes briefly, then turned her attention back to Barnes, whose eyes flicked nervously toward his legal team. The moment had arrived. "Ms. Monroe," the judge said, looking at her intently, "you may continue." Rachel stood with a measured grace, her gaze moving methodically from the judge to Barnes. She wasn't going to let up, not now, not when she was so close. "This case, Your Honor," Rachel began, her voice calm but firm, "has never just been about financial manipulation or the destruction of my career. It's about something far deeper, something buried in the past that no one knew, not even the people closest to Matthew Barnes. But now the truth is coming to light." She let the words hang in the air for a moment, allowing the tension in the room to thicken. Barnes shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but Rachel knew better than to show the satisfaction she felt. This wasn't about satisfaction. This was about justice. Before Matthew Barnes became the successful, powerful man he is today, he was my partner. And when we first started our firm, we were equals, or so I thought, Rachel continued, her eyes never leaving Barnes. But somewhere along the way, his ambition started to blind him. He became willing to do anything to stay ahead, to climb higher no matter who he trampled on to get there. Rachel paused, scanning the room. She could see the shift in the gallery. Aaron's face had gone pale, his eyes wide with confusion. Grace, seated beside him, was staring straight ahead, her lips pressed tight. She had no idea what Rachel was about to expose. Several years into our partnership, Barnes crossed a line I never expected, Rachel said, her voice gaining strength. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about power, about control. Barnes made a deal behind my back, a deal that would have ruined not just our firm but countless others in the process. He used me as a pawn, manipulated me into believing I was part of the plan, when in reality I was the scapegoat. Rachel's gaze locked onto Barnes now. That's why I had to leave, that's why everything fell apart, because Barnes couldn't live with the truth, he had to bury it, he had to bury me with it. The room was silent, save for the shifting of papers and the faint tapping of a pen. Rachel felt the weight of her words settling around her, as heavy as the years of grief and betrayal that had led her to this moment. Barnes was no longer able to hide his discomfort. His hands were shaking and his face had gone an unnatural shade of gray. His lips were pressed into a thin, angry line, but his eyes, those eyes once so confident, so certain, were now clouded with fear. You think you know the whole story, Rachel, Barnes sneered, his voice breaking. But you have no idea what I've sacrificed to get here, you have no idea what I've been through. Rachel didn't let him finish. She stepped forward, her presence commanding the room. What I know, Barnes, is that you sold out everyone who trusted you, your clients, your colleagues, and even me, but you've never paid for it, not until now. She turned toward Linda, who was already gathering the final piece of evidence, an old, private letter, one that Rachel had kept hidden for years. The letter, signed by Barnes himself, revealed the true depth of his betrayal, a secret deal with a rival firm, one that had gone unnoticed by the rest of the business world. It was the smoking gun, the final piece of the puzzle that Barnes had spent so many years hiding. Linda stood and walked forward, holding the letter out to the judge. Your Honor, this letter, dated several years ago, outlines Barnes' betrayal in his own words. It's the key to understanding why everything fell apart. The judge glanced down at the letter, then back up at Barnes, his expression unreadable. It was clear that this revelation was the turning point. The momentum had shifted entirely in Rachel's favor. Aaron's gaze flickered between Rachel and Barnes. His jaw tightened as the weight of the situation began to hit him. He hadn't understood the extent of what had happened, the depth of his mother's suffering. The truth was sinking in, and Rachel saw the recognition in his eyes, the understanding of just how much she had endured, how much she had lost. Grace, on the other hand, looked shattered, her face pale, her hands trembling in her lap. She hadn't believed Rachel. She hadn't thought it was possible that her perfect, polished life could be built on such lies. Now she was seeing it all crumble before her eyes. Rachel's voice dropped to a near whisper, but it carried across the room with the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. You didn't just ruin me, Barnes, you ruined everyone who trusted you, and now it's time for you to pay for everything. Barnes' eyes darted to the judge, his mouth opening, but no sound came out. He was drowning in his own lies, and the tide was rising fast. The judge slammed his gavel down. Enough, he barked. This court will take a recess. I need time to process these new revelations. As the room began to empty, Rachel stood motionless, watching Barnes, who sat frozen as though the very foundations of his world had shattered. And for the first time, Rachel felt a sense of finality, not just in the case, but in everything. Barnes had played his last hand. Now it was her turn to finish the game. The recess had been short, but it felt like an eternity. Rachel stood outside the courtroom, her hands pressed together, feeling the weight of the letter still in her grasp. Her mind was sharp, clear, and yet there was a lingering sense of anticipation, as if the universe was holding its breath, waiting for the next blow to fall. She could almost taste victory, but she knew it wasn't over, not yet. When the doors to the courtroom swung open again, the cold, sterile air of the room hit her like a wall. The tension was back, thicker than before, and Rachel could feel it crawl under her skin. Barnes was seated at the defense table, his back rigid, his jaw clenched. The smugness was gone now. He looked every bit the broken man, but Rachel knew better than to let her guard down. The judge took his seat again, his face unreadable. He scanned the room briefly before his gaze settled on Rachel. "Ms. Monroe," he said, his voice steady, but there was a heaviness in it, a weight that suggested even he felt the gravity of what had just transpired. Rachel nodded, her gaze flicking briefly to Barnes. "Your Honor, as I said before, this case is not just about financial fraud. It's about a betrayal that reaches into the very core of this system. And today, I am here to make sure that no one escapes the consequences of those actions." Barnes wasn't going to sit back and let her win, though. He'd been caught, but he wasn't out of tricks yet. "I call my first witness," Barnes said, his voice shaking slightly but still laced with defiance. Rachel's heart skipped as the door to the courtroom opened again. A familiar face walked in, and for a split second, Rachel's stomach dropped. It was one of her old clients, a man who had once trusted her with everything. His name was Thomas Hargrove, and he had been part of the case that had nearly ruined Rachel's career. She had helped him through a contentious lawsuit years ago, and Barnes had been the one to orchestrate the settlement, stacking the odds in his favor. Thomas had been a pawn in their game, and now here he was, standing in front of her as Barnes' witness. The moment Thomas saw Rachel, his eyes flickered briefly, but there was no sign of recognition. Instead, he took the witness stand, and Rachel felt a cold chill run down her spine. "Mr. Hargrove," Barnes began, his voice smooth but tinged with desperation, "can you tell the court about your dealings with Ms. Monroe and how she handled your case?" Thomas hesitated for a moment but then began speaking. "Rachel Monroe was one of the best attorneys I've ever worked with," he said, his tone measured, but Rachel could tell there was a hint of unease. "But I later found out some of the decisions she made were influenced by external pressures. My case was manipulated. The settlement wasn't fair, but I didn't know who was pulling the strings behind it at the time." The courtroom was quiet, every person hanging on his words. Rachel's mind was racing as she tried to process what was happening. Barnes was trying to discredit her. He was painting her as the architect of the very corruption she had uncovered, turning her own clients against her. But Rachel didn't panic. She'd been expecting this, and she wasn't going to let it throw her off balance. She stood up, calm and composed, her voice unwavering as she addressed the judge. "Your Honor," Rachel said, cutting through the receipt. "NG tension. I'm not surprised by this witness. Mr. Hargrove, while well-meaning, was never fully aware of the deals being made behind his back. I was working under Barnes' instructions that came directly from him, including the settlement I offered." The courtroom gasped as Rachel laid it all out. "Barnes manipulated the situation, pressured me into agreeing to the terms, and when things went wrong, he threw me under the bus. Mr. Hargrove doesn't know that, but I do, and I'm here to prove it." Her words hung in the air, sharp and clear, but Barnes wasn't done yet. "Objection," Barnes barked, his voice rising. "This is a distortion of facts. You can't just rewrite history, Ms. Monroe." Rachel turned to face him, her gaze cold but unwavering. "I'm not rewriting anything, Barnes. The truth is coming out whether you like it or not." Linda, who had been sitting quietly beside Rachel, stood and moved toward the judge, handing over another document, one Rachel had carefully prepared just in case. It was a letter, dated from the same time as the settlement agreement, signed by Barnes himself, detailing his orders to manipulate the case to his advantage. The judge glanced over the letter quickly, his expression shifting slightly. "Mr. Barnes," he said, his voice now tinged with something that bordered on disappointment, "it seems the evidence against you is mounting." Barnes' face turned an even deeper shade of red as he opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. His defense was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Grace, still sitting in the gallery, was shaking her head in disbelief. She had been so sure that Rachel was the one in the wrong, that her mother-in-law was just clinging to an old grudge. But now her perfect world was shattering. The truth had come crashing down, and there was no denying it anymore. Aaron, too, was staring at his mother, but there was something in his eyes now, a mix of guilt and realization. For the first time, he was beginning to see the full extent of what Rachel had endured, what Barnes had done. Rachel's chest tightened as she took a deep breath. She wasn't sure what would come next. She wasn't sure how far this would go, but for the first time in years she felt a sense of clarity. She had taken control of this fight, and she wasn't about to let anyone steal that from her. The judge cleared his throat, his eyes flicking between Rachel and Barnes, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. I think we've heard enough for today. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. to continue the proceedings. As the gavel fell, Rachel didn't look at Barnes, she didn't look at Aaron or Grace. She kept her focus straight ahead, knowing the end was near, and she was going to make sure Barnes paid for everything he'd done. The storm was coming, and Rachel Monroe was ready. The courtroom was unnervingly quiet as the judge resumed his seat. Even though Barnes' defense had been thoroughly dismantled, there was something hanging in the air, a sense of unresolved tension. Rachel could feel it, a shift that she couldn't quite place. The energy had changed, the weight of every moment now more suffocating than before. The judge, James Foster, had always seemed like the pillar of impartiality, the one figure who had remained untouched by the chaos of the trial. But now, even his posture seemed off, his back a little too stiff, his eyes a little too shifty. Rachel's instincts flared, her gut telling her that there was more to this case than just Barnes and his crooked dealings, much more. The judge cleared his throat, his voice echoing in the suddenly tense silence. "Let's proceed," he said, but there was an edge to his tone now, something unsteady beneath the surface. Rachel stood, but before she could speak, the judge's gaze flicked to her, sharp and quick. "Ms. Monroe," he said, almost too quickly, "I've seen enough. The evidence is clear. You've made your case." Rachel wasn't fooled. She knew when someone was trying to end the conversation prematurely. Her mind was already working, the gears turning, the pieces of this puzzle clicking into place. "Your Honor," she said, her voice low but filled with conviction, "I think we need to discuss something else before we proceed, something that the court has yet to see." The judge's face tightened imperceptibly, but Rachel didn't wait for permission. She stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room, briefly meeting Linda's. Linda gave her a subtle nod, a silent signal of readiness. Rachel could feel the room holding its breath. "I've done my research," Rachel continued, her voice firm, controlled, "and I've uncovered something that the court needs to know." The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes flicking nervously to the defense table. His hands clenched together in front of him. Rachel knew he was trying to maintain control, but his discomfort was palpable. "Your Honor," Rachel pressed, her words deliberate, "I have uncovered a connection between you and Mr. Barnes, a connection that goes back years." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and Rachel could feel the eyes of every person in the room turn to the judge as if they could sense something shifting in the air. She knew she had everyone's attention now, but she wasn't done. "Judge Foster," Rachel said, "you and Barnes were not just business associates. You were involved in a deal that," she paused, letting the words hang in the air like a loaded gun, "a deal that was meant to cover up a massive financial scandal, a scandal that would have ruined Barnes' career if it had been exposed." The judge's face drained of color, his fingers tightened into a fist, the knuckles going white as he fought to maintain his composure. "You can't possibly," Barnes started, but the judge held up a hand, silencing him. I'm not sure what you mean," the judge stammered, his voice shaking. Rachel's voice softened, but it carried an undeniable weight. "You were involved, Your Honor. You were one of the people who helped Barnes bury the truth, just like you've been trying to bury it here today. I have evidence, documents, and I'm going to make sure the court sees them." Linda stepped forward, holding up a folder filled with records and files. Rachel could see the moment the judge realized the gravity of what was unfolding. He wasn't just a judge presiding over a case anymore. He was a part of the very corruption Rachel had been fighting to expose. "I know this isn't easy to hear, Your Honor," Rachel said, her eyes never leaving his, "but the truth has a way of coming out. And today it's coming out whether you like it or not." There was a long silence before the judge cleared his throat, but his voice cracked as he spoke. I don't know what you're talking about. This is all baseless. This is slander." But Rachel could see the cracks in his defenses. He was no longer the confident, authoritative figure he'd been just hours ago. He was unraveling, and Rachel could feel the shift in the room. The balance had tipped. And now, it wasn't just about Barnes anymore. It was about everyone who had been complicit in this web of deceit. Suddenly, Aaron stood up in the gallery, his face tight with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "I know the truth," he said, his voice carrying across the courtroom. I know everything." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Aaron, but it was the judge who reacted first. His face paled as Aaron made his way down the aisle, his gaze fixed on the judge. "You and Barnes," Aaron continued, his voice cracking as he spoke, "you've been covering up your deals for years, you've been hiding it from everyone, from me, but I know now, I know everything." The judge's hands began to shake and he looked at Aaron with panic in his eyes. "This is not the time, Mr. Monroe," the judge said, but his voice was weak, a shadow of his usual authority. Aaron's words hit like a punch to the gut. "It's too late for that, Judge. I know everything about the deal you made with Barnes, the one that nearly cost my mother everything, and now I'm going to make sure you pay for it." The judge's face crumpled as Aaron's words sunk in. The air in the courtroom felt like it was closing in around them. Rachel could see it in his eyes now, the fear. He knew he was trapped. The judge tried to regain control, but it was too late. The truth had come rushing forward, unraveling his past and everything he had worked to protect. Rachel stood tall, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't just about Barnes anymore. It was about the whole system, the people who had covered up the corruption for years, and now the truth was coming for them all. The judge's past had been exposed, and Rachel Monroe wasn't about to let him get away with it. The gavel had come down hard. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, as though the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable. It had all come to a head: the judge, Barnes, the witnesses, and the years of deception. And now, with the sudden departure of Judge Foster from the case, it was time for the final move. The stakes had never been higher, and Rachel could feel the weight of it all pressing down on her. The courtroom doors opened once again, this time revealing a new figure, a replacement judge, someone who had clearly been appointed in light of the scandal that had just unfolded. Judge Rebecca Bellamy was a sharp contrast to Foster. She walked with authority, her eyes scanning the room as she took her seat. There was no hesitation in her posture, no sign of weakness. She was impartial, no history, no ties to anyone in the room, and that to Rachel was the most promising thing about today. "Order in the court," Judge Bellamy called, her voice steady, and the room grew silent. "I am now taking over proceedings in this case. We will continue where we left off." Rachel couldn't help but feel a flicker of relief. Foster had been compromised, his credibility shattered, but this new judge was fresh, untainted by the past. And now Rachel's case had a chance to be heard without the dark shadows hanging over it. Rachel stood, her back straight, her heart steady as she faced the court. Linda was already at her side, flipping through their last set of evidence with methodical precision. They de-prepared everything for this moment. "Your Honor," Rachel began, her voice firm, filled with the weight of years spent waiting for this. "Today we bring forward the final piece of evidence, the last truth that Barnes thought he could bury." Rachel turned to the large screen in the courtroom where Linda pressed a button on her laptop. The room fell into an absolute hush as a video began to play. It was grainy at first, the audio distorted, but Rachel knew the moment the video started playing, it would speak louder than any words ever could. It was Barnes' voice, unmistakable, followed by a conversation between him and an unnamed associate. The recording was taken years ago in a moment of arrogance when he thought no one was watching, no one was listening. "Rachel Monroe was always too trusting," Barnes' voice echoed through the room. "She was the perfect scapegoat. I pushed her out of the firm and set her up for the fall. No one would ever suspect that it was my corruption, that I was behind it all. I made sure the evidence was gone, and I made sure she took the blame." The courtroom reacted immediately, whispers spread like wildfire. Even the judge's eyes widened as she watched the undeniable evidence unfold on the screen. The recording was damning. It was his voice, his words, and it wasn't just hearsay, it was a confession. Rachel didn't flinch. She had been waiting for this moment, the moment that would finally crush Barnes' ability to lie his way out of everything. Barnes, sitting across the room, had gone pale, his face twisted into a mask of disbelief and his hands clenched into fists. His lawyer immediately tried to object, but the evidence was too clear. Public to deny. "This is a setup," Barnes shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "This isn't real, this is fabricated." "It's your voice, Barnes," Rachel cut in sharply, her voice echoing through the silent courtroom. "It's your words, you can't deny it any longer." Linda stepped forward, handing the judge a transcript of the conversation, clearly marking the key parts of Barnes' confession. The evidence was irrefutable. There was no way out for him now. The courtroom was still. The weight of the truth had settled over everyone like a heavy fog. And yet, despite Barnes' frantic attempts to deflect, the room wasn't moved. They'd all seen the truth, his confession, his lies, and his deep, insidious corruption. And it was all coming to light. Grace, who had been sitting in the gallery, her face frozen in disbelief, finally shifted. Rachel caught her eye, and for the first time she saw something different in her daughter-in-law's expression. It was shame and regret. Grace had always sided with Barnes, had always dismissed Rachel's claims. But now the world Rachel had been fighting to expose was collapsing in front of her, and Grace couldn't look away. Aaron, too, was staring at the screen, but his eyes were locked on his mother. His gaze had softened, the earlier anger and frustration replaced with something else, understanding. The truth had hit him like a wave. He finally saw the depth of what Rachel had gone through, and now he was ready to stand with her. As the video ended, the courtroom remained silent. Barnes' lawyers were already scrambling to find a way to challenge the evidence, but there was no use. The confession had been made. The case was all but over. Judge Bellamy, still watching the scene unfold before her, leaned forward, her face grim. "Mr. Barnes, it appears the evidence against you is more than sufficient. Your attempts to obstruct the truth will not be tolerated. This court will proceed with the utmost seriousness." Barnes' face twisted in rage, but Rachel didn't look away. She wasn't afraid of him anymore. He had been exposed, and there was no going back. "I want to make sure he never hurts anyone again," Rachel said, her voice low but clear, speaking not just to the judge but to everyone in the room. Aaron stepped forward, his voice carrying across the room. "I'm here for her. I'm with her no matter what it takes. We'll finish this together." The courtroom watched in silence as the final blow landed, and Rachel felt for the first time in years that the battle was finally over. The truth had won. And Barnes had lost. The courtroom had gone silent, save for the distant murmur of footsteps echoing down the long hallway. The jury, a dozen strangers tasked with deciding the fate of a man whose lies had stretched across years, had retreated to deliberate. But the air in the courtroom remained thick with anticipation. Every inch of the space seemed to hold its breath. Rachel remained seated, her back straight, but her mind a whirl of thoughts and emotions. The final evidence had been laid bare for all to see: Barnes' confession, his lies, his manipulation of the entire system. But even with the battle so visibly won, there was a part of Rachel that couldn't quiet the tremor of uncertainty in her chest. The victory wasn't over yet. The jury held the last piece of the puzzle. Their verdict was all that mattered now. She glanced over at Linda, who stood beside her, her face a mixture of exhaustion and determination. Linda had been her rock throughout this entire ordeal. Even in the darkest moments, when Rachel had thought she might never find her footing again, Linda had been the one to steady her. "Are you okay?" Linda asked softly, her voice a steady anchor amidst the tension. Rachel nodded, though the weariness in her eyes belied her words. She wasn't sure she was okay. She wasn't sure she could ever feel okay again, but she would get through this. She had to. "I've sacrificed so much for this," Rachel murmured, her voice barely audible. She wasn't talking about the case. She wasn't even talking about Barnes. She was talking about everything: her career, her reputation, her family. Linda's hand rested on Rachel's shoulder, a silent gesture of support. Rachel looked at her, and for a moment the weight of the years, the loss, the betrayal, the unspoken grief seemed to settle between them. "I'm proud of you," Linda said quietly. "You did what you had to do, and you're not alone." Rachel smiled faintly, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Her thoughts wandered to Aaron and Grace sitting quietly in the gallery. They were both still, almost too still, their expressions unreadable. Rachel's gaze lingered on Aaron. He was no longer the son who had dismissed her pursuit of justice as a reckless obsession. He was different now, more aware, more understanding of the depths she had plunged into to get to this moment. But was it too late for him to truly understand? Was it too late for her to rebuild the relationship they had once had? Grace sat beside him, her face pale, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Rachel could see the conflict in her daughter-in-law's eyes. Grace had always been the one who had sided with Barnes, who had mocked Rachel for holding on to the past. But now the world she had built around her seemed to be crumbling. She had nowhere to hide from the truth, and Rachel couldn't help but wonder if it was too late for Grace to ever see her the way she had once hoped. The clock on the wall ticked on, each second a reminder of how much time had passed, how much had been sacrificed. The courtroom was eerily quiet now, save for the murmur of hushed conversations in the back. Rachel was alone in her thoughts, caught between the remnants of a life she'd fought for and a future that was uncertain. Suddenly, she felt a light tap on her shoulder. It was Linda again, handing her something, a letter, an envelope folded and worn from age. Rachel frowned, confused. "What's this?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Linda gave a small, sympathetic smile. "It's from your husband." The mention of her late husband took Rachel by surprise. She hadn't expected to hear his name today, hadn't expected to be reminded of him, of the life they had once shared. Slowly, she unfolded the letter, her fingers trembling as she read the familiar handwriting, the neat loops and swirls of his script. "My dearest Rachel, I know you don't want to hear this, but I'm proud of you. I'm proud of the woman you've become, the woman you've always been. When the weight of this world bears down on you, when you feel like it's all too much, just remember that you have the strength to face whatever comes your way. You've always had that strength. If you're reading this, I know the fight is still raging inside you, but I want you to know this: no matter the outcome, you've already won. You've stood your ground when everyone else told you to fall. You've fought for what's right, and that's more than most can ever say. If I'm not here to see it through with you, know that I am with you in spirit, cheering you on always. Don't forget to hold your head high, Rachel, you've earned it. With all my love always. James." Rachel's chest tightened as she finished reading. The words, his final words, felt like a lifeline thrown to her from a past that felt so far away. She had spent so many years buried in grief, wondering if the strength she once had died with him. But now, with his letter in her hands, she felt it again. The same strength, the same courage that had always been a part of her. A tear slipped down Rachel's cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. The tears were not of sorrow, they were tears of release, of knowing that even though James was gone, he had always believed in her, and with that belief she could face whatever came next. Linda squeezed Rachel's shoulder. "You're going to get through this," she whispered. Rachel took a deep breath and looked up. The jury would soon return and the decision would be made, but whatever happened, she was ready. The truth had been laid bare, the fight had been worth it. The final chapter was about to be written, and she would be standing tall when it was. The courtroom was heavier now, quieter. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the weight of an entire trial about to come to an end. The jury had returned. The time had come. Rachel sat in her seat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. The silence around her felt suffocating, but she held herself steady. She had been preparing for this moment for years, and she wasn't going to let the gravity of it all break her now. The world seemed to slow as the Judge Bellamy, stood, the gavel in her hand, poised for the final strike. Barnes was seated across the room, his face drawn tight with sweat, his nervousness evident in the way his fingers twitched and his eyes darted. For the first time he seemed truly vulnerable, not the confident, powerful man who had once manipulated every situation in his favor, but a broken man, desperate and exposed. His hands gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white, but there was no escaping the truth now. Rachel remained calm, her gaze never wavered. She had fought too long, too hard to let the final stretch of this journey feel anything less than a victory. She wasn't just here for herself, she was here for everyone Barnes had hurt, for the people whose lives he had destroyed without remorse. But as much as she had fought for justice, there was a part of her that was already feeling the weight of the cost. The jury had spent hours deliberating, but Rachel had seen the shift in their faces when they returned to the courtroom. They knew the truth had been laid bare, the evidence was irrefutable. Barnes' lies were now undeniable facts, and they could not turn away from the weight of it. Judge Bellamy's voice broke the silence. The jury has reached a verdict, she said, her tone steady, her eyes scanning the room as she spoke. We will now hear their decision. Rachel felt the air shift again, the focus narrowing. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her pulse, but she knew this was the moment that would change everything. Will the foreperson please stand? Judge Bellamy asked. The foreperson rose, holding the paper in their hands. The courtroom seemed to lean in, waiting for the words that would define the outcome of a long and painful journey. Guilty on all counts, the foreperson announced, their voice clear and firm. The words hung in the air, a thunderclap that echoed through the courtroom. Rachel felt the rush of emotion hit her, but she kept her composure. This was it. The man who had destroyed her life, who had manipulated her, used her as a pawn, was now being held accountable. Barnes' face went even paler. His body went rigid, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. His lawyer reached for him, but Barnes shoved their hand away, his eyes wide with disbelief. The certainty that had once defined him was now gone, replaced by a panic he couldn't hide. Rachel didn't look at him, she didn't need to. Her focus was elsewhere, on the weight of the moment, the finality of it all. Her victory, while hard-won, felt distant, as though it wasn't entirely hers to claim. She had done everything right, fought for what was just, and yet it was still hard to shake the ache in her chest. The cost of this victory was more than just the years of her career. It was the fractured relationship with her son, the loss of the family she had once known, the years of quiet suffering she had hidden from the world. Aaron and Grace were seated in the gallery, their eyes locked on the scene before them. Aaron's expression was unreadable, but there was something there, something that told Rachel he finally understood the weight of her fight. Grace sat motionless beside him, her face pale, her eyes wide with the shock of it all. She had always dismissed Rachel's fight as a waste of time, as a grudge she should have let go of. But now she had seen it all, the corruption, the manipulation, the devastation. And Rachel wasn't sure if Grace's silence meant she finally understood, or if it was just the weight of her own guilt. Barnes' hands were shaking now, and Rachel watched as the reality of the moment hit him. He had built his empire on lies and deceit, but now it was all falling apart. The years of manipulation had finally caught up with him. He was no longer the man in control, but the man whose empire was crumbling before him. The bailiff stepped forward, handcuffs in hand. The sound of the cuffs clicking shut was the final punctuation on the sentence. Barnes was being escorted out, his shoulders slumped, his freedom slipping away. Rachel stood slowly, her body still and steady, but inside she felt a torrent of emotions welling up. This was what she had fought for, but now, standing here, she could feel the price she had paid. The tears weren't for Barnes, but for everything she had lost along the way. The pieces of her life that had crumbled, the relationships that had been torn apart. As the courtroom began to empty, Rachel's eyes met Aaron's. He stood, his expression softening, and for the first time in a long while, he stepped toward her. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." Rachel's chest tightened, and for a moment she couldn't find the words. She had spent so long fighting this battle, but this was the first real moment she had felt the possibility of healing. There was a long road ahead of them, but for the first time, Rachel didn't feel like she was walking alone. "I know," she whispered, "but we're here now." And with that, the weight of the past finally started to lift, just enough for Rachel to take a step forward into the uncertain future. The courtroom had emptied, and the buzz of whispers, the flutter of papers, the clinking of shoes on marble floors all seemed distant now. Rachel stood alone in the quiet, the weight of the past few days pressing on her chest, her body finally succumbing to the exhaustion she had been fighting off for so long. The trial was over, Barnes was behind bars, the justice she had fought for, clawed at for years, was hers at last. But victory, as she had learned all too well, came at a price. The world outside the courtroom was still adjusting to what had just happened, and so was she. Rachel took a deep breath as she walked out of the courthouse, her steps slow, deliberate. The crisp air of late afternoon greeted her, but it felt cold against her skin. She had fought so hard for this moment, but now, in the silence of her own victory, there was an ache, an emptiness she couldn't quite name. It was the aftermath. She had been on autopilot for so long, consumed by the need to bring Barnes to justice, to restore the reputation he had torn apart, that she had never allowed herself to think about what would happen when it was all over. Now, as she stepped out into the real world again, she realized that the victory she had claimed wasn't going to heal the wounds she'd carried for so many years. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Linda. "I've been thinking you should write a book. This case, everything you've gone through, people need to hear your story, your strength." Rachel's lips pressed together as she read the message. Linda had always believed in her, had always seen more than just the woman who had been wronged. She had seen the strength in Rachel, the power of resilience that had carried her through this battle. But Rachel wasn't sure. The idea of reliving it all again in the form of a book felt like a weight she wasn't sure she was ready to carry. But maybe it was time. She glanced up, catching a glimpse of herself in the reflection of the courthouse glass. The woman who stared back at her was different. Stronger, yes, but more than that, she was no longer the woman who had been broken by Barnes' betrayal. She had survived it, rebuilt herself from the rubble, and now, for the first time, she could see the future, a future she could create for herself, free of the past that had defined her for so long. As Rachel slid the phone back into her pocket, another thought crossed her mind: the press. The media had been swarming ever since Barnes' arrest. The reports, the interviews, the constant cameras following her every move. At first, she had been overwhelmed by the attention, unsure of how to handle it. But now she saw it for what it was: recognition, not just for what she had done, but for what she had represented. She had fought for justice, for truth, and now the world was finally acknowledging that fight. Back at home, the quiet was almost unsettling. The house felt empty, a stark contrast to the chaos of the past few weeks. Rachel hadn't returned to it for days, too consumed by the trial, too afraid to face the loneliness that always seemed to creep in. Now, as she stood in the living room, the weight of her solitude hung in the air, but it wasn't the kind of loneliness that had once crushed her. It was different now. She had found herself again. Her phone buzzed again, this time a call from Aaron. She hadn't spoken to him much since the verdict. Their conversations had been strained, filled with the unspoken things that still lingered between them. "Mom," Aaron's voice was hesitant when she answered. "How are you holding up?" "I'm okay," Rachel replied softly, though she knew he could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "I've been thinking," he said, and Rachel could hear the weight of his words. "I should have been there for you. I should have understood sooner everything you were going through." Rachel closed her eyes for a moment, letting his words sink in. Her heart had been heavy with the distance between them, but now, hearing the regret in his voice, she could feel the crack in the wall they had built between them. "We're here now," Rachel said, her voice steady, but her heart felt lighter. "We'll figure it out, one step at a time." There was a pause on the other end. When he spoke again, it was with more conviction. "I want to help you with whatever comes next, I mean it." Rachel smiled faintly, though the weight of the conversation hadn't completely lifted. She knew their relationship would never go back to what it had been, but perhaps, in time, it could be something new, something better. They had both changed, and perhaps this new version of their relationship was what they needed to heal. As she hung up, Rachel thought back to Linda's suggestion about the book. Maybe it wasn't just about telling her story for others. Maybe it was about telling it for herself, to finally put the past behind her and begin something new. She stood by the window, looking out at the city below. The world was still moving the same way it always had, but Rachel had changed. She had stood tall in the face of betrayal and won. He had taken back what was hers, and now it was time to start living for herself. And as the news reports of Barnes' downfall continued to pour in, Rachel felt a quiet pride settle within her. She had done it. She had taken down the man who had ruined her life, and in the process she had rebuilt herself. The battle had been brutal, but it had been worth it. The world was watching, and now, for the first time in years, Rachel Monroe was ready to take the next step forward. The winter months had passed, and the world seemed to have moved on. Rachel had too. The dust had settled from the trial, the media frenzy had quieted, and Barnes was behind bars where he belonged. Her life, once filled with the weight of betrayal and loss, now had the space to breathe again. But even after the courtrooms, the press, the endless nights spent piecing together a shattered career, she could still feel the emptiness of certain things that remained unspoken. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. The screen displayed Aaron's name. Her heart skipped before she could steady her breath. "Mom, it's Aaron," his voice came through clearly, but there was an unfamiliar softness in it. "Can we talk?" Rachel hesitated. It had been months since they'd really spoken, months since their last strained conversation after the trial. Since then, their relationship had hung in the air like something broken, unfinished. He had apologized then, but words had felt hollow, the distance between them felt insurmountable. "I'll meet you tomorrow, Aaron," she said finally. The next day, Rachel arrived at the small cafe near her apartment, the familiar chime of the door ringing softly in her ears. She had thought of this moment many times since the verdict, but no amount of imagining had prepared her for the reality of it. Aaron was already there, sitting at a corner table by the window, his posture tense, the man who had once been so sure of everything now looking fragile in the daylight. When he saw her, he stood, his face softening with a mixture of regret and something more, perhaps hope. Rachel's own heart thudded in her chest. She hadn't seen him like this in years. The last time they'd been together in the same room, so much had been unspoken. Now he was the one reaching out. "Hey, Mom," Aaron said, his voice low but sincere. "I'm sorry, I should've." Rachel held up her hand. "You don't need to apologize, not anymore, let's just talk." He sat down, pushing the chair back a little as if unsure whether to dive in or pull back. For a moment, Rachel felt herself falter, unsure of how to start the conversation. She had been through so much, and yet, for all the pain she had fought through, Aaron still felt like the part of her life she hadn't been able to save. "I've been thinking," Aaron started again, clearing his throat, "about everything, about what you went through and how I never saw it, how I didn't understand, I couldn't, not until after everything came out and I saw it all, what Barnes did, what you went through." Rachel's fingers tightened around the mug of coffee in front of her, but she didn't say anything. She wasn't sure if she wanted to speak yet, but Aaron wasn't done. "I was a coward," he said quietly, his eyes not meeting hers. "I didn't stand by you when you needed me most, and I let all that stuff about the firm cloud my vision. I was selfish. I see that now. I'm sorry." Rachel swallowed hard. His words were honest, raw, and it stung, but in a way, it was what she had been waiting to hear, what she had been desperate for, even if she hadn't fully realized it at the time. "I didn't do this for you to apologize, Aaron," she said, her voice firm but calm. "I didn't go through all of this to have you feel guilty. I did it because it was the right thing to do, because Barnes wasn't just ruining my life. He was ruining so many other lives. You don't owe me anything, but I needed to do this for myself." Aaron met her gaze then, and she saw something shift in his eyes. Something clicked. Finally, after all this time, he was starting to understand the depth of the battle she had fought, the battle that had torn her apart not just professionally but personally. "I know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I get it now." Just then, Rachel's phone buzzed again. A message. It was from Grace. "Can we talk? I think we need to." Rachel stared at the message, the lump in her throat returning. Grace. The woman who had never truly understood her fight, the one who had stood with Barnes, never once considering the possibility that Rachel might be telling the truth. But Rachel had changed. She had fought for her truth, for the integrity that Barnes had stolen from her, and if she could face her son, could she face Grace too? Could she offer her the same honesty, the same understanding? "Mom," Aaron's voice cut through her thoughts. "Are you okay?" Rachel looked at him, the weight of the past months settling. I'm fine," she said, her voice steady, "but I'm not sure I'm ready to face Grace just yet." Aaron nodded slowly, but there was a sense of resolve in him. "If you decide to talk to her, I'll be here, but it's your call." Rachel looked out the window then, the world outside bustling with the noise of the living. The world she was now part of again, a world that had moved on but left her standing at the edge of it, unsure where she fit. But something had shifted inside her. She had faced the worst, come out stronger on the other side, and now she was willing to face whatever came next, even the ones who had never understood. Because in this moment, she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't the same person she had been before the trial. And neither was her son. In the silence that followed, she looked up and smiled faintly. "I'm here now, Aaron, and that's enough for me." For the first time in a long while, Rachel felt like she could take a step forward, and it was hers to take on her own terms. The premiere of the documentary was a grand affair, filled with bright lights and the hum of quiet conversations. The theater was packed, not just with journalists and industry professionals, but with people whose lives had been touched by Rachel's fight. The opening credits rolled, and Rachel sat among them, her hands resting in her lap, feeling a calmness she had not expected. The film, an honest portrayal of the battle she had fought, was finally complete. It captured everything: the pain, the betrayal, and ultimately the redemption. As the screen flickered with images of courtrooms and evidence being presented, Rachel saw herself on screen, not the broken woman she had once been, but a fierce advocate for truth, a woman who had never backed down. For the first time in a long while, Rachel was able to watch her story through the eyes of others. The film didn't just focus on the legal triumph, it showcased the toll it had taken on her family, the heartbreak, the lost years, but it also painted her as a hero in her own right. Her strength, her resilience, they were the heart of the film. The credits rolled to a hush, followed by a round of applause. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she stood, clapping along with everyone else, though she felt as though she were watching herself from a distance. It was surreal to see her life, her fight, her journey immortalized on screen. As the crowd began to disperse, a few people came up to her: journalists, fans, even some of her former colleagues who had witnessed the fallout from her legal battle. They offered congratulations, admiration for her courage. She smiled, accepting their words, but there was something deeper in her, a quiet peace that had settled within her over time. She had done what she set out to do. The world had seen the truth. Rachel's gaze wandered across the theater. Her eyes landed on Aaron and Grace sitting near the back. Grace's face was unreadable, but there was something different in her eyes now, a recognition. She had seen it, perhaps for the first time, what Rachel had truly sacrificed. Aaron, on the other hand, seemed conflicted. He was looking at Rachel, his expression one of quiet understanding but also regret. His gaze was filled with an apology she had already heard, a silent acknowledgement of the time lost between them. They were both here in the same space, and for the first time in months, Rachel didn't feel anger or resentment. She only felt a quiet sadness, a recognition of what had been lost and a hope that one day it could be rebuilt, maybe not perfectly, but enough. The room around Rachel seemed to fade as she watched her son and daughter-in-law. It wasn't the full reconciliation she'd hoped for, but it was progress. They had seen the truth, and that was enough for now. Rachel's phone buzzed. She pulled it out and saw dozens of messages, not just from old colleagues but from people she didn't know, strangers, supporters. Their words were filled with gratitude, with admiration for what she had done. She had become something of a symbol, a beacon for those who had suffered in silence, who had fought against corruption but felt unheard. Rachel had become their voice. The next few weeks brought in more recognition. Interviews, magazine features, and even offers to mentor young lawyers who had been in the same position she had once been. It was overwhelming at times, but Rachel welcomed it, knowing that she could help others who had faced betrayal, injustice, and systemic corruption. She could offer them the guidance that had once been so desperately missing from her life. As she sat at her desk, surrounded by the letters and messages of support, Rachel felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The fight had been worth it, not just for her, but for everyone who had been affected by Barnes' treachery. And now, as a mentor to those just starting their careers, she was determined to pass on the lessons she had learned, to fight for truth no matter the cost, and to never let the darkness of betrayal define who you were. Rachel stood by the window of her apartment one evening, watching the city lights flicker below. It was a rare moment of quiet, and she allowed herself to reflect. There had been a time when she thought she would never be able to move past the pain, when she thought Barnes had stolen everything from her. But now, she had rebuilt. She had found herself again. And in that moment, she knew that the legacy she left behind wasn't just about the case or the conviction of Barnes. It was about the strength to stand up after everything had been torn down, to rise, and to continue fighting for what was right. When the judge went pale, I knew it wasn't just the case he feared, Rachel thought, her voice a whisper in her mind. It was the truth I carried all along. She had carried it through every dark moment, every betrayal, and now the world would finally understand that. The truth was her legacy, and with it, she had changed everything. For the first time in years, Rachel Monroe stood tall, knowing that the fight was over, and that, despite the cost, it had been worth it.